The streets of Los Angeles were unusually quiet that evening, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost foreboding. Shaquille O'Neal sat in the back seat of his SUV, his large frame relaxed against the plush leather interior. The soft hum of jazz played through the car's speakers, but his mind was elsewhere. The city lights of downtown flickered against the tinted windows, their glow unable to pierce through the cloud of restlessness that hung over him. Shaq had spent the day bouncing between meetings, charity events, and interviews. Despite his fame and success, days like these often left him feeling drained. The older he got, the more he yearned for something deeper, something that reminded him of the simple joys of life. But tonight, his thoughts would take an unexpected turn. As the car slowed to a stop at a red light on the edge of downtown, something outside the window caught Shaq's eye. A frail figure sat hunched on the cold sidewalk, wrapped in a blanket so thin it barely looked capable of warding off the chill. Her silver hair, disheveled and wild, fluttered in the cold winter breeze. She clutched a small bag to her chest, her posture one of quiet desperation. Shaq's first instinct was to look away. He had seen scenes like this before. Homelessness was an unfortunate reality in many cities, and Los Angeles was no exception. But something about this woman made him pause. There was a sense of familiarity in the way she held herself, in the gentle slope of her shoulders, and in the way her hands trembled slightly as they clung to the bag. "Stop the car," Shaq said suddenly, his deep voice cutting through the quiet jazz. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, surprised. "You sure, Mr. O'Neal? This isn't the best area." "Just stop the car," Shaq insisted, already unbuckling his seatbelt. The SUV eased to the curb, and Shaq stepped out into the biting cold. The night air hit him like a wave, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the woman ahead. She hadn't looked up, seemingly lost in her own world. As he approached, the feeling of familiarity grew stronger. Shaq's towering frame cast a long shadow over the sidewalk, but still, the woman didn't notice him. He crouched down slightly to get a better look at her face, and when he finally saw her eyes, his breath caught in his chest. "Mrs. Henderson?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman flinched at the sound of her name. Slowly, she lifted her head, her tired, sunken eyes meeting his. For a moment, she simply stared at him, as if trying to place his face. Then her eyes widened, and a flicker of recognition sparked within them. "Shaquille?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's me," Shaq said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's Shaq." Mrs. Henderson's lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. Her hands tightened around the bag in her lap, and she looked away, shame washing over her face. I didn't want you to see me like this," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Shaq felt a lump form in his throat. This woman, sitting here on the cold, unforgiving sidewalk, was the same Mrs. Henderson who had once been his elementary school teacher. She had been the one to see potential in him when no one else did, the one who had encouraged him to embrace his height and use it as a gift rather than a source of embarrassment. She had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself, and now, here she was, forgotten and abandoned by the world. "You don't have to be embarrassed," Shaq said softly, lowering himself to sit beside her on the sidewalk. "What happened, Mrs. Henderson? How did you end up here?" She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "It's a long story," she said finally, "one you don't need to hear. You've got your own life, Shaquille. You don't need to worry about me." Shaq shook his head. "I owe you everything, Mrs. Henderson. You don't get to tell me not to worry." For a moment, they sat in silence. The sounds of the city buzzed around them, cars honking in the distance, the faint hum of a nearby street performer, but it all felt distant and unimportant. "You shouldn't be out here," Shaq said finally, his voice firm. "Come with me. Let me help you." Mrs. Henderson hesitated again, but the cold wind whipped through the air, causing her to shiver. Shaq noticed and made up his mind. He stood, extending a hand toward her. "Please," he said, "let me do this for you." After a long pause, Mrs. Henderson reached out and took his hand. Her grip was weak, but there was a quiet strength in the way she allowed herself to lean on him as he helped her to her feet. Shaq guided her to the SUV, shielding her from the wind with his large frame. The driver opened the door, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern, but he didn't say a word. Once they were inside, Shaq turned to Mrs. Henderson. "We'll get you somewhere warm first," he said. "Then you can tell me everything." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Shaquille," she said softly. Shaq placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You were there for me when I needed it most," he said. "Now it's my turn to be there for you." As the car pulled away from the curb, Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He didn't know what had brought Mrs. Henderson to this point, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. The city lights blurred outside the window as the SUV sped through the streets, carrying with it two people bound by a shared history and a chance for redemption. The warm glow of the hotel room's bedside lamp cast a soft light over Mrs. Henderson's weary face. She sat on the edge of the neatly made bed, clutching a steaming cup of tea that Shaq had insisted she drink. Her hands trembled slightly, the warmth of the tea a stark contrast to the biting cold she had endured for years. Shaq sat across from her, his massive frame almost dwarfing the small armchair he had pulled closer to her. He had so many questions swirling in his mind, but he knew better than to bombard her all at once. Mrs. Henderson was here now, safe and warm, and that was what mattered most. For a long moment, the room was silent, save for the muffled hum of the city outside. Finally, Shaq broke the silence. "Mrs. Henderson," he began gently, "what happened? How did things get this bad?" Mrs. Henderson took a shaky sip of her tea, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It's not a story I'm proud of, Shaquille," she said quietly, "but I suppose I owe you the truth." Shaq leaned forward, his eyes filled with concern. "You don't owe me anything," he said, "but if you want to tell me, I'm here to listen." She sighed deeply, the weight of her memories seeming to press down on her frail shoulders. "After my husband passed away, everything started to unravel," she began. Her voice was steady, but there was an undeniable sorrow in her tone. "You remember Mr. Henderson, don't you? He was a good man. We didn't have much, but we had each other. When he died," her voice faltered, and she paused to gather herself. "When he died, I thought I could manage on my own. But the truth is, I was lost without him." Shaq nodded, remembering the kind man who would occasionally visit their classroom to help with school events. Money was always tight, but after his death, it became impossible. The bills piled up, and my health started to decline. The arthritis made it harder and harder for me to teach, and eventually, I had to retire earlier than I planned. I thought I could live off my pension, but it wasn't enough. Not with the medical expenses. Shaq's jaw tightened as he listened, his heart breaking for the woman who had once been so full of life and energy. "I sold the house," she continued, her voice growing quieter. "The house we'd built together. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I thought selling it would give me enough to live on for a while. But I was wrong." She paused, her hands gripping the cup a little tighter. "I trusted someone I shouldn't have. A friend, or at least I thought she was a friend. She offered to help me sell the house, said she knew someone who would give me a good deal. But it was all a lie. They cheated me, Shaquille. I didn't realize it until it was too late." Shaq felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he kept his expression calm, not wanting to upset her further. "They took the house and left me with almost nothing," she said, her voice trembling. "I tried to fight back, but I didn't have the money for a lawyer. After that, I had no choice but to move into a shelter." She looked up at Shaq, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do you know what it's like to live in one of those places, Shaquille? To hear people screaming in the middle of the night, to wake up and find your belongings stolen? It's not living. It's surviving. Barely." Shaq's fists clenched in his lap, his heart aching for the woman who had once been a source of strength and guidance for him. "It got worse when the shelter burned down," she continued. "I lost everything I had left. My photographs, my teaching certificates, even the little keepsakes from my husband. Everything was gone." She took another sip of her tea, her hands still trembling. "After that, I ended up on the streets. I tried to find work, but no one wants to hire an old woman who can barely stand for more than a few minutes. So, I just drifted, day by day, trying to find enough to eat, somewhere to sleep. I told myself I'd get back on my feet, but the truth is, I was too tired, too broken. Shaq leaned forward, his voice filled with emotion. Why didn't you reach out for help, Mrs. Henderson? You could have called me, or someone else. Anyone. She shook her head, a sad smile crossing her face. I didn't want to be a burden, and besides, who would have helped? My own sons didn't even care. The mention of her sons made Shaq's expression darken. He had heard her talk about them when he was a child, always with pride and love. The idea that they had abandoned her was almost too much to bear. What happened with your sons? He asked carefully. They promised they'd take care of me, she said, her voice heavy with pain. But promises are easy to break when someone becomes an inconvenience. At first, they called and visited, but over time, the calls stopped. The visits stopped. And when I asked for help, they told me they couldn't afford it, that they had their own families to take care of. Shaq's fists clenched again, but he forced himself to stay calm. I tried to understand, she continued. I really did. But it's hard not to feel hurt when the people you sacrificed everything for turn their backs on you. Shaq reached out and placed a comforting hand on hers. You didn't deserve that, he said firmly. None of this is your fault. Mrs. Henderson looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. You were always a good boy, Shaquille, she said softly. I knew you'd do great things, but I never imagined you'd be the one to save me. Shaq shook his head, his voice steady. You saved me first, Mrs. Henderson. Now it's my turn. As the night wore on, Mrs. Henderson shared more details of her life, her struggles, and her quiet hopes that one day things might get better. Shaq listened intently, vowing silently that he would do everything in his power to make those hopes a reality. When she finally drifted off to sleep, Shaq sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. He felt a storm of emotions. Anger at the injustices she had faced, sorrow for her pain, and determination to make things right. This isn't the end for you, Mrs. Henderson, he whispered to himself. Not if I have anything to say about it. And with that thought, he began to plan. The next morning, sunlight poured through the hotel window, illuminating the small but cozy room. Mrs. Henderson sat quietly at the small dining table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. Shaq had already ordered a hearty breakfast for her, but she had barely touched it, her thoughts seemingly elsewhere. Shaq entered the room, his massive frame filling the doorway, carrying a folder in one hand and his phone in the other. He had been up since dawn, making calls, doing research, and putting together a plan to help Mrs. Henderson. But something about her story from the night before wasn't sitting right with him. Morning, Mrs. Henderson, Shaq said, his voice warm and gentle. How are you feeling? She looked up, offering him a faint smile. Better. Thank you, Shaquille. You've already done so much for me. Not enough, he replied firmly, setting the folder down on the table and taking a seat across from her. She glanced at the folder nervously. What's that? It's something I need to ask you about, Shaq said, leaning forward slightly. Mrs. Henderson, I've been thinking about what you told me last night. About the house, the shelter, your sons, and I just feel like there's more to the story. Her eyes darted away, and she took a sip of her tea to avoid answering. Shaq waited a moment before continuing. I'm not trying to pressure you, but if there's anything you're not telling me, I need to know. The more I know, the more I can help you. She sighed deeply, setting the cup down on the table. You're right, she admitted. There is more. But I didn't want to burden you with all of it. Shaq shook his head. You're not a burden, Mrs. Henderson. I promise. For a moment, she sat in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. Finally, she began to speak. After my husband passed, I told you I sold the house. But what I didn't tell you was why I sold it so quickly, she said. It wasn't just because of the bills. It was because of my eldest son. Shaq's brow furrowed. What do you mean? She hesitated, her voice trembling as she continued. He got himself into trouble with the law. Nothing too serious at first, just some unpaid debts. But then things escalated. He got involved with the wrong people, and they started threatening him. When he couldn't pay them back, they came to me. Shaq's fists clenched under the table. They came to you? What did they want? They wanted money, she said. And they didn't care how I got it. They said if I didn't pay, they'd hurt him. I was terrified, Shaquille. I couldn't let anything happen to my son, so I did the only thing I could think of. I sold the house to pay off his debts. Shaq leaned back in his chair, struggling to process what he was hearing. And that's how you ended up with nothing? She nodded. I thought it would be enough to make everything right, but it wasn't. After I paid them off, my son promised me he'd turn his life around. But he didn't. He disappeared. And when I needed him the most, he wasn't there. Shaq exhaled slowly, trying to calm the anger rising in his chest. And your other son? Did he know about this? He knew, she admitted. But he said it wasn't his problem. He told me I shouldn't have sold the house in the first place, that it was my fault for trying to fix everything. Shaq shook his head in disbelief. That's not fair, Mrs. Henderson. None of this is your fault. She gave him a sad smile. Life isn't fair, Shaquille. I learned that a long time ago. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Shaq stared at the folder on the table, his mind racing. Mrs. Henderson, he said finally, I've been doing some digging. I think the person who helped you sell your house might have been part of a scam. Her eyes widened. A scam? He nodded. I called a friend of mine who works in real estate. I gave him the details you mentioned last night, and he did some research. The person who brokered the sale has been involved in multiple fraud cases, targeting elderly homeowners. They convince people to sell their homes at a fraction of their value, and then flip them for a massive profit. Mrs. Henderson's face paled. So they stole my home? Essentially, yes, Shaq said. But don't worry. We can do something about it. My friend said there's a chance we could take legal action and get some of that money back. It won't be easy, but it's worth a shot. Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled as she covered her face. I can't believe this. All this time, I thought it was just bad luck. I never imagined. Shaq reached across the table and placed a comforting hand on hers. It's not your fault, he said firmly. They took advantage of you. But now that we know the truth, we can fight back. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. You've already done so much for me, Shaquille. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't need to repay me, he said. You just need to let me help you. As the day went on, Shaq made more calls, contacting lawyers and investigators who could help build a case against the fraudulent real estate broker. At the same time, he began trying to track down Mrs. Henderson's sons, determined to confront them and understand why they had abandoned their mother. By the time evening came, Mrs. Henderson was resting in her room, her frail body finally beginning to relax after years of stress and hardship. Shaq stood by the window, staring out at the city lights, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. This wasn't just about helping Mrs. Henderson get her life back. This was about justice, about standing up for someone who had been wronged in every possible way. She gave me so much when I had nothing, Shaq whispered to himself. Now it's my turn to give back. With renewed determination, he picked up his phone and dialed another number. The fight was just beginning, and Shaq was ready for it. The next morning, Shaq sat at the small desk in the hotel room, his laptop open and his phone buzzing every few minutes with incoming calls. He had been working tirelessly, coordinating with his lawyer friends and contacts in real estate to uncover more about the scam that had stolen Mrs. Henderson's home. Yet, as determined as he was to bring justice to her, something about her story still didn't sit right with him. Mrs. Henderson was asleep in the next room, her frail form finally finding some rest after years of hardship. As Shaq scrolled through his notes, his thoughts drifted to the sons she had mentioned. The betrayal of her own children gnawed at him. How could they abandon someone who had given so much for them? Shaq had grown up valuing family above all else, and the idea of leaving a parent to suffer alone felt incomprehensible. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was one of his assistants, whom he had asked to help dig into Mrs. Henderson's background. Here's what I found, Mr. O'Neill, the assistant said, handing him a folder. It's about her two sons. There's more to the story than we thought. Shaq's brows furrowed as he opened the folder. Inside were photos, court documents, and financial records. The first document caught his attention immediately. It detailed an old legal case involving her eldest son. Mrs. Henderson never mentioned this, Shaq muttered, reading the document carefully. The case involved unpaid debts, But what stood out was the fact that Mrs. Henderson had sold her house not just to pay off the debts, but to settle a criminal case on behalf of her son. The records showed she had taken full responsibility for the charges, which had allowed her son to avoid jail time. Why would she do that? Shaq wondered aloud. She took the fall for him, the assistant explained. If she hadn't, her son would have gone to prison. The mention of her sons made Shaq's expression darken. He had heard her talk about them when he was a child, always with pride and love. The idea that they had abandoned her was almost too much to bear. "What happened with your sons?" he asked carefully. "They promised they'd take care of me," she said, her voice heavy with pain. But promises are easy to break when someone becomes an inconvenience. At first, they called and visited, but over time, the calls stopped. The visits stopped. And when I asked for help, they told me they couldn't afford it, that they had their own families to take care of. Shaq's fists clenched again, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I tried to understand," she continued. "I really did. But it's hard not to feel hurt when the people you sacrificed everything for turn their backs on you." Shaq reached out and placed a comforting hand on hers. "You didn't deserve that," he said firmly. "None of this is your fault." Mrs. Henderson looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "You were always a good boy, Shaquille," she said softly. "I knew you'd do great things, but I never imagined you'd be the one to save me." Shaq shook his head, his voice steady. "You saved me first, Mrs. Henderson. Now it's my turn." As the night wore on, Mrs. Henderson shared more details of her life, her struggles, and her quiet hopes that one day things might get better. Shaq listened intently, vowing silently that he would do everything in his power to make those hopes a reality. When she finally drifted off to sleep, Shaq sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. He felt a storm of emotions: anger at the injustices she had faced, sorrow for her pain, and determination to make things right. "This isn't the end for you, Mrs. Henderson," he whispered to himself. "Not if I have anything to say about it." And with that thought, he began to plan. The next morning, sunlight poured through the hotel window, illuminating the small but cozy room. Mrs. Henderson sat quietly at the small dining table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. Shaq had already ordered a hearty breakfast for her, but she had barely touched it, her thoughts seemingly elsewhere. Shaq entered the room, his massive frame filling the doorway, carrying a folder in one hand and his phone in the other. He had been up since dawn, making calls, doing research, and putting together a plan to help Mrs. Henderson. But something about her story from the night before wasn't sitting right with him. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Shaq said, his voice warm and gentle. "How are you feeling?" She looked up, offering him a faint smile. "Better. Thank you, Shaquille. You've already done so much for me." "Not enough," he replied firmly, setting the folder down on the table and taking a seat across from her. She glanced at the folder nervously. "What's that?" "It's something I need to ask you about," Shaq said, leaning forward slightly. "Mrs. Henderson, I've been thinking about what you told me last night. About the house, the shelter, your sons, and I just feel like there's more to the story." Her eyes darted away, and she took a sip of her tea to avoid answering. Shaq waited a moment before continuing. "I'm not trying to pressure you, but if there's anything you're not telling me, I need to know. The more I know, the more I can help you." She sighed deeply, setting the cup down on the table. "You're right," she admitted. "There is more. But I didn't want to burden you with all of it." Shaq shook his head. "You're not a burden, Mrs. Henderson. I promise." For a moment, she sat in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. Finally, she began to speak. "After my husband passed, I told you I sold the house. But what I didn't tell you was why I sold it so quickly," she said. "It wasn't just because of the bills. It was because of my eldest son." Shaq's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her voice trembling as she continued. "He got himself into trouble with the law. Nothing too serious at first, just some unpaid debts. But then things escalated. He got involved with the wrong people, and they started threatening him. When he couldn't pay them back, they came to me." Shaq's fists clenched under the table. "They came to you? What did they want?" "They wanted money," she said, "and they didn't care how I got it. They said if I didn't pay, They'd hurt him. I was terrified, Shaquille. I couldn't let anything happen to my son, so I did the only thing I could think of. I sold the house to pay off his debts. Shaq leaned back in his chair, struggling to process what he was hearing. And that's how you ended up with nothing? She nodded. I thought it would be enough to make everything right, but it wasn't. After I paid them off, my son promised me he'd turn his life around. But he didn't. He disappeared. And when I needed him the most, he wasn't there. Shaq exhaled slowly, trying to calm the anger rising in his chest. And your other son? Did he know about this? He knew, she admitted. But he said it wasn't his problem. He told me I shouldn't have sold the house in the first place, that it was my fault for trying to fix everything. Shaq shook his head in disbelief. That's not fair, Mrs. Henderson. None of this is your fault. She gave him a sad smile. Life isn't fair, Shaquille. I learned that a long time ago. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Shaq stared at the folder on the table, his mind racing. Mrs. Henderson, he said finally, I've been doing some digging. I think the person who helped you sell your house might have been part of a scam. Her eyes widened. A scam? He nodded. I called a friend of mine who works in real estate. I gave him the details you mentioned last night, and he did some research. The person who brokered the sale has been involved in multiple fraud cases, targeting elderly homeowners. They convince people to sell their homes at a fraction of their value, and then flip them for a massive profit. Mrs. Henderson's face paled. So they stole my home? Essentially, yes, Shaq said. But don't worry. We can do something about it. My friend said there's a chance we could take legal action and get some of that money back. It won't be easy, but it's worth a shot. Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled as she covered her face. I can't believe this. All this time, I thought it was just bad luck. I never imagined. Shaq reached across the table and placed a comforting hand on hers. It's not your fault, he said firmly. They took advantage of you. But now that we know the truth, we can fight back. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. You've already done so much for me, Shaquille. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't need to repay me, he said. You just need to let me help you. As the day went on, Shaq made more calls, contacting lawyers and investigators who could help build a case against the fraudulent real estate broker. At the same time, he began trying to track down Mrs. Henderson's sons, determined to confront them and understand why they had abandoned their mother. By the time evening came, Mrs. Henderson was resting in her room, her frail body finally beginning to relax after years of stress and hardship. Shaq stood by the window, staring out at the city lights, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. This wasn't just about helping Mrs. Henderson get her life back. This was about justice, about standing up for someone who had been wronged in every possible way. She gave me so much when I had nothing, Shaq whispered to himself. Now it's my turn to give back. With renewed determination, he picked up his phone and dialed another number. The fight was just beginning, and Shaq was ready for it. The next morning, Shaq sat at the small desk in the hotel room, his laptop open and his phone buzzing every few minutes with incoming calls. He had been working tirelessly, coordinating with his lawyer friends and contacts in real estate to uncover more about the scam that had stolen Mrs. Henderson's home. Yet, as determined as he was to bring justice to her, something about her story still didn't sit right with him. Mrs. Henderson was asleep in the next room, her frail form finally finding some rest after years of hardship. As Shaq scrolled through his notes, his thoughts drifted to the sons she had mentioned. The betrayal of her own children gnawed at him. How could they abandon someone who had given so much for them? Shaq had grown up valuing family above all else, and the idea of leaving a parent to suffer alone felt incomprehensible. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was one of his assistants, whom he had asked to help dig into Mrs. Henderson's background. Here's what I found, Mr. O'Neill, the assistant said, handing him a folder. It's about her two sons. There's more to the story than we thought. Shaq's brows furrowed as he opened the folder. Inside were photos, court documents, and financial records. The first document caught his attention immediately. It detailed an old legal case involving her eldest son. Mrs. Henderson never mentioned this, Shaq muttered, reading the document carefully. The case involved unpaid debts, but what stood out was the fact that Mrs. Henderson had sold her house not just to pay off the debts, but to settle a criminal case on behalf of her son. The records showed she had taken full responsibility for the charges, which had allowed her son to avoid jail time. Why would she do that? Shaq wondered aloud. She took the fall for him, the assistant explained. If she hadn't, her son would have gone to prison. Shaq leaned back in his chair, trying to process this revelation. Mrs. Henderson had sacrificed everything to protect her child, even if it meant losing her home and livelihood. But what made it worse was the fact that her son had disappeared afterward, leaving her to bear the consequences alone. Shaq clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath the surface. How could someone take such a sacrifice for granted? Later that afternoon, Mrs. Henderson woke to find Shaq sitting in the small living area, deep in thought. She noticed the folder on the table and the grim expression on his face. "What's wrong, Shaquille?" she asked, her voice soft. Shaq hesitated, not wanting to upset her, but he knew they couldn't move forward without addressing the truth. "Mrs. Henderson," he began gently, "I found out about the case involving your eldest son." Her face fell, and she lowered her gaze. "I see," she said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Shaq asked. "You've been carrying this burden alone for so long. You didn't have to." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "Because I was ashamed," she admitted. "Ashamed of the choices I made, and ashamed of what my son became. I thought, if I could save him, maybe he'd turn his life around. But I was wrong." Her voice broke, and Shaq moved closer, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did what any parent would do," he said softly. "You tried to protect him." "But at what cost?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I gave up everything, Shaquille. My home, my savings, my future. And he just disappeared. He hasn't spoken to me in years. Sometimes I wonder if he even thinks about me at all." Shaq's heart ached for her. She had made an impossible choice out of love, only to be repaid with abandonment. "I'm going to find him," Shaq said firmly. Mrs. Henderson looked at him, startled. "No, Shaquille. You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do," he said, his voice steady. "He needs to understand what you did for him, and he needs to make things right." The search for Mrs. Henderson's son wasn't easy. It took days of digging, calls to old contacts, and even hiring a private investigator. But eventually, Shaq found him. The eldest son, Eric, was living in a small apartment in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. When Shaq arrived unannounced, Eric opened the door with a look of surprise and confusion. "Shaquille O'Neal?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "That's right," Shaq said, his towering frame blocking the doorway. "We need to talk." Eric hesitated, but eventually stepped aside, letting Shaq in. The apartment was cluttered and dimly lit, a reflection of the chaos in Eric's life. "I'm here because of your mother," Shaq began, his voice calm but firm. Eric's expression darkened. "I don't want to talk about her," he said, turning away. "Well, you're going to," Shaq said, his tone hardening. "She gave up everything for you. She sold her home, took on your debts, and even ruined her own life to keep you out of prison. And what did you do? You left her. You abandoned her when she needed you most." Eric's shoulders tensed, and he turned back to face Shaq. "You think I don't feel guilty?" he snapped. "You think I don't know what I did? I couldn't face her, okay? I couldn't stand to see the disappointment in her eyes." "That's not good enough," Shaq said sharply. "She's your mother. She doesn't care about your mistakes. She just wants to know that you care about her." Eric's anger gave way to shame, and he sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "Start by showing up," Shaq said. "She doesn't need your money or your excuses. She needs her son." That evening, Shaq returned to the hotel, unsure of what to tell Mrs. Henderson. But to his surprise, Eric was already there, sitting in the lobby, fidgeting nervously. When Mrs. Henderson came down and saw him, her eyes filled with tears. "Eric," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mom," Eric said, standing awkwardly. I'm sorry. For everything." Mrs. Henderson hesitated for a moment before stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him. "You're here now," she said softly. "That's all that matters." Shaq watched the reunion from a distance, a sense of satisfaction filling him. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. As Eric promised to stay in her life, Shaq knew that Mrs. Henderson's journey was far from over. But for the first time in years, she had hope, and Shaq was determined to help her rebuild from here. The following morning, the hotel room was filled with an air of cautious hope. Eric had stayed nearby overnight after his emotional reunion with Mrs. Henderson. Though their relationship was fragile, the first steps toward healing had been taken. Shaq, however, knew there was still a long way to go, not just for Mrs. Henderson and Eric, but for the larger battle she was fighting. Seated at the small table in the hotel room, Shaq spread out a collection of documents. They included financial records, legal paperwork, and notes from the investigation into the fraudulent sale of Mrs. Henderson's home. Eric sat nearby, looking uneasy as he sifted through his own memories. "I still can't believe how bad things got," Eric muttered, staring at the paperwork. "You don't have to believe it," Shaq replied, his voice calm but firm. "You just have to face it. We can't fix anything if you keep looking away." Eric sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know how to make it up to her. She gave everything for me, and I ruined her life." You didn't ruin her life," Shaq interrupted, "but you didn't protect it either. Now's your chance to change that." Mrs. Henderson sat quietly in the corner, her hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea. Her frail frame and tired eyes betrayed years of hardship, but there was a quiet strength in her presence. "It's not all his fault, Shaquille," she said softly. "I made my choices, and I'd make them again if it meant keeping my son safe." Shaq turned to her, his expression gentle. "You shouldn't have had to make those choices, Mrs. Henderson. The people who took advantage of you need to be held accountable." By mid-afternoon, Shaq's phone buzzed with a call from one of his contacts in real estate law. He stepped outside the room to take the call, pacing the hallway as he listened to the update. "You're not going to believe this," the lawyer said. "The person who scammed Mrs. Henderson isn't just some low-level con artist. He's a big name in real estate development. This guy's been running scams like this for years, targeting elderly homeowners and flipping their properties for massive profits. And get this, he's got political connections that have kept him out of trouble so far." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Can we take him down?" "There's a way," the lawyer replied. "We've got enough evidence to file a lawsuit. But it won't be easy. His legal team is tough, and he's going to fight this every step of the way." "Let him fight," Shaq said, his voice firm. "We're going to win." Back in the hotel room, Shaq laid out the situation for Mrs. Henderson and Eric. "This guy didn't just cheat you," Shaq explained. "He's been doing this to other people too. If we take him to court, we won't just be fighting for you. We'll be fighting for everyone he's hurt." Mrs. Henderson looked down at her hands, her expression thoughtful. "It's been so long," she said quietly. "I'm not sure I have the strength for a fight like this." "You don't have to do it alone," Shaq said. "You've got me, and you've got Eric. We'll stand by you every step of the way." Eric nodded, guilt and determination mingling in his expression. "Mom, I let you down once. I'm not going to let it happen again. I'll do whatever it takes to help." Her eyes softened, and she reached out to place a hand on Eric's. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. Over the next few days, Shaq's team worked tirelessly to build the case. They gathered documents, interviewed witnesses, and reached out to other victims of the scam. Media outlets began to take notice of the story, drawn in by Shaq's involvement and the emotional weight of Mrs. Henderson's plight. Eric, too, began to step up in ways he hadn't before. He drove Mrs. Henderson to her appointments, helped her organize her remaining belongings, and even began writing a letter of apology for the years he had been absent from her life. But not everything was smooth. As news of the lawsuit spread, the real estate developer, a man named Victor Langston, began to push back. His legal team filed motions to dismiss the case, and he used his connections to paint Mrs. Henderson as a bitter, incompetent woman who had willingly signed away her home. Shaq saw the headlines and felt his anger flare. "They're trying to make her look like the villain," he told his lawyer during one of their strategy meetings. "We can't let them get away with this." The lawyer nodded. "Don't worry, Shaq. We've got evidence, and we've got witnesses. Let them try to spin the story. The truth will come out in court." The day of the first court hearing arrived, and the tension was palpable. Shaq stood by Mrs. Henderson as they entered the courthouse, his towering presence offering a sense of reassurance. The media swarmed them, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. But Shaq shielded Mrs. Henderson from the chaos, guiding her inside with a protective hand on her shoulder. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Langston sat across the room, flanked by a team of expensive lawyers. He exuded confidence, smirking occasionally as if the outcome was already in his favor. But as the proceedings began, the tide started to turn. The evidence against Langston was damning. Documents showing the undervaluation of Mrs. Henderson's home, testimony from other victims, and even a former employee who admitted to being part of the scheme. When Mrs. Henderson took the stand, her testimony was raw and emotional. She spoke of the pain of losing her home, the betrayal she felt, and the years of hardship that followed. Her voice trembled, but she never wavered, her words resonating with everyone in the room. By the time she finished, even the judge seemed moved. That evening, back at the hotel, Mrs. Henderson sat with Shaq and Eric, the weight of the day beginning to lift. "You were incredible today," Shaq said, a smile breaking across his face. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "We're not done yet," Eric added. "But we're going to see this through, Mom. All of it." Mrs. Henderson looked at her son, her eyes glistening with tears. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for justice, but for her family as well. As Shaq watched them, he knew this fight was far from over. But he also knew that together, they had the strength to win. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs the next morning as the second day of hearings began. Shaq sat in the front row, his large frame impossible to ignore, but his focus was solely on Mrs. Henderson. She sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by her lawyer and Eric, who had insisted on being by her side. Though her hands trembled slightly, her face radiated quiet determination. This was her fight now, and she wasn't going to back down. Across the room, Victor Langston lounged in his chair, his smug demeanor unshaken despite the mounting evidence against him. His team of high-powered attorneys whispered amongst themselves, their confidence clear in their posture. Langston had been through lawsuits before, and he always managed to emerge unscathed. But this time was different. As the hearing continued, Mrs. Henderson's lawyer presented even more damning evidence. Financial records proved that Langston's company had systematically targeted elderly homeowners, offering them deals that seemed fair on paper but were riddled with legal loopholes that left them penniless. A key piece of evidence was a recording from one of Langston's former employees, who had come forward after learning about the lawsuit. In the recording, the employee described how Langston would personally approve fraudulent contracts, ensuring that the homeowners had no recourse once their properties were sold. The courtroom fell silent as the recording played, Langston's voice cold and calculating. "Get them to sign quickly," his voice said. "They won't read the fine print. They never do." Shaq clenched his fists as he listened, his anger barely contained. How many lives had this man ruined with his greed? Langston's lawyers tried to object, but the judge overruled them. The recording was admissible evidence, and it painted a damning picture of their client. When the time came for Langston's team to respond, they relied on their usual tactics, deflection and character assassination. They claimed Mrs. Henderson had willingly signed the contract, that she had been fully aware of what she was doing. They implied that she was financially irresponsible and painted her as someone looking for a scapegoat for her misfortune. Shaq's blood boiled as he listened, but he knew Mrs. Henderson's lawyer was prepared. When it was their turn to rebut, the lawyer called Mrs. Henderson back to the stand. The courtroom was silent as Mrs. Henderson took her seat. Her frail hands gripped the edges of the witness stand, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "I may not be a rich woman," she began, her voice filled with quiet strength, "but I've always been honest. I trusted Mr. Langston and his team because I believed they were helping me. I didn't know I was signing away my home, my future, and everything my husband and I worked so hard for. All I knew was that I needed help, and they took advantage of that." Her words were simple but powerful, cutting through the noise of legal jargon and complicated arguments. "I've spent years trying to survive," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I've lost my home, my dignity, and almost my hope. But I'm here today because of people who reminded me that I still matter. That justice matters. She looked directly at Langston, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and resolve. You didn't just take my home. You stole a part of my life. And I'm here to take it back. As she stepped down from the stand, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Even Langston seemed to falter, his smirk fading as he realized the impact of her testimony. Outside the courtroom during a break, reporters swarmed Shaq and Mrs. Henderson. Questions flew from all directions. Shaq, why are you so invested in this case? Mrs. Henderson, how do you feel after sharing your story? Shaq held up a hand, his deep voice cutting through the noise. I'm here because Mrs. Henderson was there for me when I needed her. Now it's my turn to stand by her. This isn't just about one person. It's about doing what's right. No one should be treated the way she was. Mrs. Henderson, standing beside him, added softly, I hope this case shows that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. And I hope it helps others like me find the courage to fight back. That evening, back at the hotel, Mrs. Henderson sat with Shaq and Eric in the small sitting area. There was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. I don't know how you stay so calm in there, Eric said, shaking his head. I was ready to jump out of my seat when they started blaming you for everything. Mrs. Henderson smiled faintly. I've learned that anger won't get you far. The truth is on our side, and that's all we need. Shaq nodded in agreement. She's right. And we've got more than just the truth. We've got momentum. Langston's team is scrambling, and they know it. The next day, the final witness took the stand. A woman in her 60s who had also been a victim of Langston's scheme. Her story mirrored Mrs. Henderson's in many ways, and her testimony reinforced the pattern of exploitation that Langston's company had engaged in. By the time the closing arguments were made, it was clear that Langston's confidence had been shaken. His smirk was gone, replaced by a tense, guarded expression. Mrs. Henderson's lawyer delivered a powerful closing statement, emphasizing the humanity of the case. This isn't just about contracts or legal loopholes, he said. This is about justice, about protecting the most vulnerable among us from those who would prey on them for profit. Mrs. Henderson is not just a victim. She's a survivor. And she deserves justice. A week later, the verdict was delivered. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Shaq sat beside Mrs. Henderson, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as the judge read the decision. We find in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Henderson, the judge announced. The court orders Mr. Langston to pay restitution and penalties totaling $3 million. Furthermore, his company's practices will be subject to federal investigation. The room erupted in murmurs, but all Mrs. Henderson could do was sit in stunned silence. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of the moment hit her. Shaq grinned, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. You did it, he said softly. No, she replied, looking up at him with gratitude. We did it. As they left the courtroom, surrounded by reporters and supporters, Mrs. Henderson felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope. The courtroom victory marked a turning point in Mrs. Henderson's life. For the first time in years, she could breathe without the weight of fear and uncertainty pressing down on her. The restitution awarded by the court would allow her to rebuild her life. But Shaq knew that healing wasn't just about money. It was about helping Mrs. Henderson rediscover her purpose, the light that had once defined her. A week after the trial, Shaq sat with her in the living room of a small, temporary apartment he had rented for her. The space was modest but comfortable, with bright sunlight streaming in through the windows. Mrs. Henderson, dressed in a new cardigan Shaq had gifted her, looked far more rested and at peace than she had in years. You've got your life back now, Shaq said, leaning forward on the couch. But I know you, Mrs. Henderson. You're not the type to just sit around. You've got too much to give. She smiled faintly, holding a cup of tea in her hands. I suppose I do, she admitted, but I'm not sure what I can do anymore. Teaching feels like a lifetime ago. Maybe, Shaq said, a grin spreading across his face. But it doesn't have to be. That afternoon, Shaq drove Mrs. Henderson to a small community education center in downtown Los Angeles. The center served underprivileged children, offering after-school programs and tutoring for kids who often fell through the cracks of the education system. As they entered the brightly decorated building, the sound of children laughing and chatting filled the air. Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up as she looked around, her hand brushing over a poster on the wall that read, "Education is the key to unlocking the future." "This place," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "It feels like a school." "It's not quite the same as your old classroom," Shaq said, "but it's close enough." They were greeted by the center's director, a warm and energetic woman named Patricia. Shaq had reached out to her days earlier, sharing Mrs. Henderson's story. Patricia had been eager to meet her, impressed by her resilience and excited about what she could bring to the center. "Mrs. Henderson," Patricia said, shaking her hand, "it's an honor to meet you. Shaq told me all about what an amazing teacher you were. I think you'll fit right in here." Mrs. Henderson hesitated, glancing nervously at Shaq. "I don't know," she said softly. "It's been so long since I've taught. What if I'm not good at it anymore?" Shaq crouched slightly to meet her eye level, his expression gentle but firm. "You taught me how to believe in myself, remember?" he said. "Now it's my turn to remind you. You're still that amazing teacher. These kids need someone like you." Her eyes softened, and after a moment's pause, she nodded. "All right," she said. "I'll give it a try." Over the next few days, Mrs. Henderson began volunteering at the center. At first, she worked behind the scenes, organizing supplies and helping Patricia with administrative tasks. But soon, Patricia encouraged her to step into the classroom. Her first day teaching was nerve-wracking. She stood in front of a group of 12 children, her hands trembling slightly as she introduced herself. "Hello," she began, her voice shaky but kind. "My name is Mrs. Henderson, and I'm here to help you learn." The children stared at her curiously, their eyes wide with curiosity and skepticism. One boy in the back raised his hand. "Were you a teacher before?" he asked. Mrs. Henderson smiled. "Yes, I was. For over 40 years. The boy tilted his head. "Why'd you stop?" The question caught her off guard, but she answered honestly. "Life took me in a different direction," she said. "But I'm happy to be here with all of you now." As the lesson began, Mrs. Henderson's nerves slowly melted away. She found herself slipping back into the rhythm of teaching, her passion for education reigniting with every question the children asked. By the end of the day, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: joy. One child in particular caught her attention, a shy girl named Lily who struggled with reading. Lily reminded Mrs. Henderson of Shaq as a child, quiet and hesitant, but with a spark of potential just waiting to be nurtured. Over the weeks that followed, Mrs. Henderson worked closely with Lily, encouraging her to read aloud and build her confidence. One afternoon, Lily approached her after class, holding a book in her hands. "Mrs. Henderson," she said shyly, "I finished the book you gave me." Mrs. Henderson beamed, her heart swelling with pride. "That's wonderful, Lily. How did you like it?" Lily smiled for the first time since Mrs. Henderson had met her. "It was really good. Can I borrow another one?" "Of course," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice warm. "I'll find you something I think you'll love." As the weeks turned into months, Mrs. Henderson became a beloved figure at the center. The children adored her, and the staff admired her dedication. But most importantly, she began to feel whole again. One evening, as she packed up her things after a long day, Patricia approached her with a smile. "You've been doing amazing work here," Patricia said. "The kids love you, and I can see how much of an impact you're having on them. Have you ever thought about coming on board full-time?" Mrs. Henderson blinked in surprise. "Full-time?" she repeated. Patricia nodded. "We'd love to have you as an official part of the team. The job won't make you rich, but it'll give you a chance to do what you love every day." Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her mind racing. But then she thought of Lily, of the boy in the back of the classroom who always had a mischievous grin, of the children who looked at her with curiosity and trust. "I'd love to," she said finally, her voice steady. That evening, Shaq came by the apartment to check on her. She told him about the job offer, and he grinned. "I told you," he said. "You're a natural. These kids are lucky to have you." Mrs. Henderson smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you, Shaquille," she said, "for everything. I wouldn't have made it this far without you." "You don't have to thank me," he replied. You're the one who taught me everything I know about believing in people. I'm just passing it on." As Mrs. Henderson sat by the window that night, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had found her purpose again, and this time, she knew she wasn't alone. Weeks passed, and Mrs. Henderson began to flourish in her new role at the Community Education Center. Her life was finally on an upward trajectory, but one part of her journey remained unresolved. Though the court had ruled in her favor and awarded her restitution, Victor Langston, the man who had stolen her home and countless others, had yet to be held accountable for his actions beyond financial penalties. Shaq, ever determined, knew that true justice meant more than just a court order. It meant exposing Langston for the harm he had caused and ensuring he could no longer prey on others. One crisp morning, Shaq arrived at the community center to find Mrs. Henderson grading papers at her desk. Her energy was infectious, and her smile had become a daily sight for the children. "You look busy," Shaq said with a grin as he walked in. Mrs. Henderson chuckled, adjusting her glasses. "These kids keep me on my toes, but I wouldn't have it any other way." Shaq sat across from her, his expression turning serious. "I'm glad to see you so happy, Mrs. Henderson, but there's still one thing we need to address." She looked at him, her smile fading slightly. "Langston?" He nodded. "We got the money back, but he's still out there, probably planning his next scam. I've been doing some digging, and it turns out he's already eyeing another neighborhood for his next big deal." Mrs. Henderson's brow furrowed, her hands resting on the desk. "How do we stop him?" Shaq leaned forward. "By making sure everyone knows the truth about what he's done. We have to expose him, not just in court, but in the public eye. He's been hiding behind his wealth and connections for too long." That afternoon, Shaq called a press conference in front of the courthouse where Mrs. Henderson's case had been decided. Dozens of reporters showed up, eager to hear from the basketball legend and the woman whose story had captured national attention. Mrs. Henderson stood beside Shaq, her hands clasped tightly but her head held high. Shaq stepped up to the podium first, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. "Victor Langston has spent years exploiting vulnerable people for his own profit. Mrs. Henderson's case is just one of many, but we're not going to let him get away with it anymore." He gestured to Mrs. Henderson, who stepped forward to speak. Though her voice trembled at first, it grew stronger with each word. "People like Victor Langston think they can take advantage of those who have no one to fight for them," she said. "But thanks to Shaquille and so many others, I've learned that no one is ever truly alone. I'm here today to tell my story, not just for myself, but for everyone he's hurt. Together, we can make sure this never happens again." The press conference sparked a media firestorm. News outlets ran stories about Langston's history of fraud, and more victims came forward, sharing their experiences and adding to the growing pile of evidence against him. Meanwhile, Shaq's team worked behind the scenes to organize a federal investigation into Langston's business practices. The pressure mounted as regulators began scrutinizing every aspect of his company. Langston, once untouchable, found himself on the defensive. In a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation, Langston reached out to Shaq with an offer. One evening, Shaq received a call from an unknown number. He answered, and the smooth, arrogant voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Mr. O'Neill," Langston said, "let's be reasonable. We don't need to keep dragging this out in the media. I'm willing to make a deal." Shaq's voice was cold. "What kind of deal?" "I'll donate to one of your charities," Langston replied. "A sizable amount. All I ask is that you back off. Let's end this quietly." Shaq's grip tightened on the phone. "You think you can buy me off?" Langston chuckled. "I think we can help each other. You're a businessman. You understand how these things work." "No," Shaq said, his voice like steel. "What I understand is that you ruin people's lives and think you can walk away without consequences. I'm not backing off, Langston. Not now, not ever." Before Langston could respond, Shaq hung up. Days later, Langston was served with subpoenas for multiple federal investigations. His company's assets were frozen, and his high-profile investors began to distance themselves from him. But the final blow came during a televised interview. Shaq and Mrs. Henderson were invited to share her story on a major news network. As the cameras rolled, Mrs. Henderson spoke candidly about the fear and pain she had endured, but also about the strength she had found in herself and the people who had supported her. "I'm not the same person I was when this all started," she said. "I'm stronger now, and I won't let anyone else go through what I went through. People like Victor Langston think they can silence us, but they're wrong. We're louder than ever." The interview went viral, and the public backlash against Langston was swift and unforgiving. Protesters gathered outside his office, demanding justice for his victims. The turning point came when one of Langston's former business partners decided to cooperate with investigators. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Langston was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud and racketeering. The news broke one evening while Shaq and Mrs. Henderson were having dinner at her apartment. Eric burst into the room, holding his phone. "They got him," he exclaimed. Mrs. Henderson looked up, her eyes wide. "What do you mean?" "They arrested Langston," Eric said, showing her the headline. "He's going to jail." Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled as she read the article. For a moment, she was silent, processing the news. Then she looked up at Shaq, her eyes glistening with tears. "You did it," she said softly. Shaq shook his head. "No, we did it. You stood up for yourself, Mrs. Henderson. You fought back. This is your victory." That night, as Mrs. Henderson sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle, she felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. For the first time in years, she could look to the future without fear. And she knew, deep in her heart, that this was just the beginning. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of Mrs. Henderson's small apartment, highlighting the tidy space that had become her new home. The furniture was modest but cozy, the bookshelves lined with donated novels and educational materials she had started collecting for her work at the community center. Though life was far from perfect, it finally felt like she had regained some semblance of control. Shaq stopped by early that day, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a stack of papers. He had spent the previous evening working with his team to finalize the next steps for Mrs. Henderson's restitution and help her navigate her financial recovery. "You're up early," Shaq said as he set the coffee down on the small dining table. Mrs. Henderson glanced up from the lesson plan she was reviewing for the center. "These kids keep me busy," she said with a smile. "But I don't mind. It gives me something to look forward to every day." Shaq grinned. "That's the Mrs. Henderson I remember." The moment of lightheartedness was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her eyes darting to Shaq as if silently asking whether she should answer. "Go ahead," Shaq said, standing to his full height. "I'll be right here." She opened the door to find Eric standing nervously on the other side, holding a small box in his hands. "Mom," he said quietly. "Eric," she replied, her tone a mix of surprise and apprehension. "Can I come in?" he asked. She hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Eric glanced at Shaq, who gave him a curt nod but said nothing. Eric sat across from his mother at the dining table, the box still clutched in his hands. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for the right words. I wanted to bring you something," he said finally, setting the box on the table. Mrs. Henderson raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" He pushed the box toward her. "It's some of Dad's things. I kept them after you sold the house. I thought maybe you'd want them back." Her hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside were small, cherished items that had once belonged to her late husband. His favorite watch, a few old photographs, and a worn leather notebook where he had scribbled poems and ideas. Tears welled up in her eyes as she carefully lifted each item, memories flooding back. "I thought I'd lost these forever," she whispered. Eric's voice broke as he spoke. "I should have given them to you sooner. I didn't know how. I've been such a terrible son, Mom. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me." Mrs. Henderson looked up at him, her expression softening. "Eric, you hurt me deeply," she said, "but you're still my son, and I've never stopped loving you." Eric wiped his eyes, his guilt written all over his face. "I want to make it up to you, Mom. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to be there for you now. I want to help." Mrs. Henderson reached across the table and took his hand in hers. "Then start by showing up," she said simply. "That's all I've ever wanted." Later that afternoon, Shaq and Mrs. Henderson took a walk through the park near her apartment. The air was crisp, and the sound of children playing in the distance brought a warmth to the otherwise cool day. Eric seemed sincere today, Shaq said as they strolled along the path. Mrs. Henderson nodded. I think he's trying. It'll take time, but I'm willing to give him that chance. Shaq glanced at her. And your other son? Have you heard from him? She sighed, shaking her head. Not yet, but I'm not giving up hope. If Eric can find his way back, maybe his brother can too. Shaq stopped walking and turned to face her. You've got more strength than anyone I've ever met, Mrs. Henderson. Most people would have given up by now, but you keep moving forward. She smiled gently. I think I've learned that strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up, no matter how many times you've been knocked down. Over the following weeks, Eric became a regular presence in Mrs. Henderson's life. He drove her to and from the community center, helped her with errands, and even volunteered at the center on occasion. Though their relationship was far from perfect, each small act of kindness and effort chipped away at the wall of hurt that had built up over the years. One evening, as they sat in the apartment eating a simple dinner, Eric glanced at Mrs. Henderson. Mom, he said hesitantly, do you think I can come with you to the center sometime? I'd like to see what you're doing there. Her face lit up with a mix of surprise and joy. I'd love that, Eric, she said. A few days later, Eric accompanied her to the center for the first time. He watched as she worked with the children, her patience and warmth evident in every interaction. Seeing her in her element brought back memories of his own childhood, of the sacrifices she had made for him and his brother. At the end of the day, as they walked to the car, Eric turned to her. You're amazing, Mom, he said. I don't know how you do it. She chuckled softly. It's not about how I do it. It's about why I do it. These kids remind me that no matter how hard life gets, there's always something worth fighting for. Back at the apartment, Eric found himself staring at his phone, hesitating. Finally, he made a call. Hey, he said when the line connected. It's me. We need to talk about Mom. A week later, Mrs. Henderson opened her apartment door to find both of her sons standing there. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at them, unsure of what to say. The younger son stepped forward, his face full of regret. Mom, he said quietly, I'm sorry. For everything. Can we come in? Mrs. Henderson hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside. As the three of them sat together in the living room, years of pain and misunderstanding began to unravel. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, it felt like healing was truly possible. That evening, Shaq stopped by to check on her. She told him about the reunion with her sons, her face glowing with cautious optimism. I'm proud of you, Shaq said. Mrs. Henderson smiled. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Shaquille. You didn't just help me rebuild my life. You helped me rebuild my family. Shaq shook his head. You did that yourself, Mrs. Henderson. I just gave you the chance. As they sat together, watching the city lights twinkle outside the window, Mrs. Henderson felt a deep sense of peace. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time in years, she truly believed that brighter days were ahead. The sun hung low over Los Angeles, casting a golden glow over the community education center where Mrs. Henderson had found a new purpose. Inside, the small classroom buzzed with life as children gathered around her, their faces lit with curiosity and excitement. The once shy Lily eagerly raised her hand to answer a question about the short story they were discussing, while a mischievous boy in the back finally smiled as Mrs. Henderson gently encouraged him to share his thoughts. Standing just outside the door, Shaq watched through the small window, a proud grin spreading across his face. The scene before him was a far cry from the cold, dark night when he had first found Mrs. Henderson on the streets. Now, she was thriving, and her resilience had become a beacon of hope, not just for the children she taught, but for everyone who had followed her story. Later that evening, the Education Center hosted a small celebration to honor Mrs. Henderson and the impact she had made since joining the team. Teachers, parents, and students gathered in the center's modest hall, its walls decorated with colorful artwork and thank-you cards from the children. Patricia, the center's director, stood at the front of the room, smiling warmly as she addressed the crowd. Tonight, we celebrate not just an incredible teacher, but an incredible human being, she began. Mrs. Henderson's journey is a testament to the power of resilience, compassion, and the belief that it's never too late to make a difference. The room erupted into applause as Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her cheeks flushed with emotion. She held a small plaque that the children had made for her, its surface adorned with their signatures and the words, "Thank you for believing in us." As the applause died down, she adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "I don't know if I deserve all this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I do know that I've been blessed to find a second chance. Teaching has always been my calling, and these past months have reminded me of the joy it brings." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "But I couldn't have done it alone. Shaquille, you gave me that second chance. You reminded me of my worth when I had forgotten it. For that, I will always be grateful." Shaq nodded, his eyes glistening as the crowd erupted into applause once more. As the event wound down, Shaq and Mrs. Henderson sat together at one of the tables, watching the children play in the corner. "You've built something amazing here," Shaq said, his voice warm.